I have been playing Resident Evil since I was a kid, from being too scared to be in the same room while the cutscenes were playing, to finally getting it when I was a bit older, and genuinely enjoying the challenge along with the camp as a teenager. Hell, I'll still play Remake once or twice a year around Halloween. I love Resident Evil. And when you love something, you kind of hate it too. Like most people, the series lost all of its steam for me around 5 and 6, not counting any of the spin-off titles. When 7 came out, I was hopeful but skeptical, and ultimately disappointed. From its lack of puzzles to its lopsided gameplay and pacing, it felt as though Capcom ditched what made the original 3 so enjoyable for more traditional scares and a more forward attempt at gameplay progression and level design, with some small callbacks along the way. Enter Resident Evil 2 Remake, announced in August of 2015 and released in January of 2019. The game understandably went through a lot of changes, from something that looked and played a lot like Resident Evil 4 to something that looks and plays a lot like Resident Evil 7. This game was going to be a marriage between the cutting-edge, almost uncanny valley graphics and gore of Resident Evil 7, the camera and perspective of Resident Evil 4, and the level design and gameplay progression of old-school Resident Evil 2. This game should have been a slam dunk for me, but once again, I'm slightly underwhelmed. But it's a step in the right direction, though. Maybe this video is a series of dumb nitpicks, maybe it's nostalgia goggles on full blast, or maybe it's the realization that the mainstream AAA games market is no longer trying to appeal to players like me. But I'm going to try and identify some reasons why this just didn't work for me, why it fell flat, and what Capcom can hopefully avoid in Resident Evil 8. I'm not going to touch on Mr. X or the boss fights, you've probably heard a wealth of complaints about those already. I don't think I can come up with anything that hasn't already been said, but to put it plainly, they suck. Moving past that. Of all the things that irked me about this game, above all else was the controls. Resident Evil is known for the backwards way of handling its 3D environment, commonly referred to as tank controls. The player is allowed to move forward and back, but not side to side. Aiming your weapon turns the player character into a turret, and changing direction is done in a similar manner by turning the character while remaining in place, like a tank on treads. Not only is this unintuitive, but also clunky and slow. This served a purpose though. In fact, it's part of the original style's genius. It creates tension for the player as they now have to worry about even controlling the game correctly in addition to whatever may be happening on screen. It added another layer of danger to the slow-moving enemies that towered in the narrow hallways before you. It was a learning curve you overcame alongside the in-game character. You eventually reclaim your bearings just as they do. Form and content are one. Resident Evil 4 created the template that all modern action games have evolved from, but if we break it down to its core, it has those same controls. The character is able to move forward and back, but turning is done on the spot, and readying the weapon turns them into a stationary turret. There is some breathing room given with the movement, but at its core, it's all there. The only thing different is the camera. This scheme is great. It adds to the difficulty of the game without feeling cheap or overly video gamey. The enemies feel less difficult or dangerous as the game goes on, not because they become weaker or you have more ammo, but because you've better adapted to fighting them. You've become more comfortable in your own skin, and that's genius. Flash forward to Resident Evil 7. With a new, first-person camera perspective, the old control scheme would no longer work. Capcom adopted the old reliable Call of Duty-style controls, made them a whole lot stickier, and even found room for a guard button. It works for 7 because of the restricted field of view and a greater emphasis on stealth. Running off of the same engine, Capcom carried this control layout over to the third-person view of Resident Evil 2 Remake, removing the slower, more methodical elements like crouching and the guard button, which I happen to like. Now, I'm not saying Resident Evil 2 Remake should have had tank controls or just a copy-paste job of Resident Evil 4, but what we got doesn't do the game justice. You already know how to play the game as soon as you pick it up. You've played these controls 1,000 times before. While that isn't necessarily a bad thing, you just never really get any better or worse at it. After you size them up, the first zombie you encounter is going to be just as dangerous as any other zombie in the game because there's no more difficulty curve or learning experience with controlling the game. There might be a moment or two when you figure out that a zombie speeds up when they're about to lunge, or that the enemies laying on the ground are still dangerous, but overall avoiding them or shooting around them remains stagnant. There's never a moment when it all clicks, when you finally feel capable of efficiently avoiding unneeded fights. You can learn quirks about the enemies and their behavior, but never about yourself. Feeling in control, or rather the lack thereof, was integral to the atmosphere of the previous games, both physically and metaphorically. With Resident Evil 2 Remake, I never doubted my ability. I totally felt in control and collected with everything that was happening. I never had that panic of a surprise enemy in my brain trying to work out what to do next with my hands, and my hands not being able to communicate with the controller, and my brain not being able to react fast enough to my character turning the wrong way, and that zombie getting a nice big bite out of Jill. An increased amount of player mobility isn't all bad, though. It opens up doors of possibility for other playstyles. The game can throw more enemies at you now that avoiding them is easier. The areas also have to be carefully redesigned in a way that makes you feel claustrophobic even though you have omnidirectional movement. These things still make the game feel tense, but just in a different, sometimes less effective manner. Though, I do feel like there is a missed opportunity with the increased movement. Remember in Resident Evil games when you had to push things? It was like that classic movie scene where the detective discovers a hidden passage behind the bookshelf. It's a puzzle mechanic that developers can use to some really interesting effect with omnidirectional movement, but it's gone. For the most part. In fact, what happened to all of the puzzles? I thought this was something that Resident Evil was known for. It was, to me at least. Usually in horror games, and more specifically Resident Evil, you have two kinds of puzzles. Logic puzzles, something that involves you analyzing a riddle or something like a sliding device and you use your brain to solve it through trial and error and critical thinking. And we have the adventure game, find the key and put it in the keyhole puzzles. These are satisfying in the same way that a scavenger hunt is enjoyable, only you have to remember where the found item is needed as well. Resident Evil 2 Remake has just 2 or 3 true logic puzzles. This electrical path that requires you to find parts and then solve a System Shock style grid puzzle, those chess piece plugs, and then there's some liquid that drains and fills up in certain increments of which you're required to get a specific amount. Other than that, you'll spend most of your time searching for items and trying to find where those items fit. I won't really touch on the puzzles that are needed to get the 3 plates for the lobby statue. I wouldn't even really qualify those as puzzles. The only thing you're doing is really looking at a notebook page and replicating what you see there onto the dial on screen. What a mental flex. Totally gone are the room-dominating puzzles like the night room or the overgrown plant from the Spencer Mansion. One set piece I did enjoy though was the small part that we got to play as Sherry, an obvious callback to the similar segment of the original game, but now we're ducking and hiding from the police chief instead of avoiding zombies and dogs. This segment, which could be classified as one big environmental puzzle, was a nice break from the action-oriented main game while still keeping the tension high. Puzzles are an important part of Resident Evil's balancing act. They give players a well-deserved moment of solitude and thoughtful reflection, which this game had very little of. Puzzles also allow the game time to be spent in a more creative and dynamic way instead of just run-and-gun action. In fact, these quiet and introspective puzzles make the heart-pounding action feel more rewarding. This juxtaposition is necessary to help the game from feeling tired and to prevent the player from becoming callous to the enemies. Even Resident Evil 4 in its action shooter style still had scavenger hunt mechanics with collectibles that almost felt necessary for upgrading your weapons and purchasing healing. Alone time spent collecting ammo and searching through drawers and cabinets let the player prepare for the next segment while also allowing them to take a breath and just enjoy the environment around them. Resident Evil 2 Remake, with its ever-present enemies and eventually Mr. X, doesn't give the player that type of breathing room. If there was a moment of solitude in the game, all that meant to me was that a boss fight was coming up sooner rather than later. The game always feels like it's bearing down on you, like you're going to be crushed under its weight unless you keep running. There's no room for puzzles. There is a moment of having to use an item on something, it's just a doorway that leads to more shooting, or another room of enemies to dump your supplies into. This type of problem solving, in conjunction with the level design, means you're never far from an item box. You'll never have to carry that puzzle piece around with you and look for where it goes. You almost always already know where it goes by the time you find it. Even the puzzle of inventory management is removed to a degree. This ticking clock feeling can be really tense at times, but without the weight of puzzles on the scale, a lot more playtime and progression has to be pushed upon the gunplay and the enemy difficulty. These changes fundamentally alter how the game progresses and how it tackles difficulty. Speaking of which, a Resident Evil game. Those are supposed to be difficult, aren't they? But what makes them difficult? For one, the controls, but we've already covered that. Enemy placement and frequency, scarcity of supplies and saves, one-hit kill attacks, and cheap death can all make a Resident Evil game more difficult, or at least feel like it. Resident Evil 2 Remake does these things reasonably well. Kind of, well, it's complicated because of something called adaptive difficulty, otherwise known as the game's AI, damage, and item frequency adjusting itself to further fit your playstyle to make the game feel more difficult or easier depending on your personal performance. For the record, my first playthrough was on hardcore, which meant tougher enemies and limited saves. From my small experience, the enemy difficulty was all over the place, mostly due to this adaptive difficulty. The basic zombies felt like bullet sponges, which I'm not complaining about. It felt appropriate for these walking corpses to be near invincible without a critical hit blowing their head apart. I had much more of an issue with the lickers and the game teaching me early on that it only takes one flame round from the grenade launcher to toast them, only to die later because an enemy who I thought was killed slashed me from behind, costing me progress. Unpredictability and the unknown is the linchpin of horror though, Mike. Well, you'd be right in this statement, viewer, and in this aspect, the adaptive difficulty works within the context of the game, even if it is annoying at times. Other instances, not so much. I often found myself not really caring about how many bullets I threw at enemies, or how often I would heal. As long as I didn't go overboard, I knew the game would always have more ammo and healing for me just where I needed it, when I needed it. The game wouldn't let me do well, and at the same time, it wouldn't let me do poorly. It would let me die, but it would always help me back up and give me a piece of candy for trying. I never ran out of ink ribbons, and I don't know if that's because the game's AI planned it that way, or if I was good at conserving them. The game really impressed me at first with its drip feed of supplies and hordes of enemies, but after playing a few hours and beginning to understand how it works mechanically, the game stopped feeling like something immersive and more like a video game. The unpredictability and unknown became the opposite. I was beginning to be able to know what to expect out of the game and outguess it. It's ironic because in a way this game felt more stagnant than any other title in the series, even though that's what the adaptive difficulty is supposed to prevent. Ultimately though, I'm conflicted on this point, because what's the alternative? I don't think I would have had a very enjoyable time had I gotten myself stuck in a situation without healing or ammo, or conversely if I had stomped through the game feeling like it was too easy. I suppose that's the tricky part. Who should the difficulty be balanced around? The AAA single-player games market has a complicated relationship with difficulty these days. We have games like Assassin's Creed and Spider-Man that are more time-consuming than they are difficult. Any sense of challenge can be eliminated through grinding and character upgrades. At the same time, games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne prove that a difficult game has its place in mainstream media, as long as it's part of its identity. Which I suppose that's what all of this boils down to. Resident Evil is having an identity crisis. It tries to be something that appeals to old fans while drawing in new people. It wants you to remember the previous games fondly while forgetting what made them so good. It tries to maintain that difficult game identity it once had while stripping out everything other than tough enemies and scarce ammo. I don't want to rag on this game too hard. I ended up liking it a lot more after my B scenario. As a horror fan, I'm just really excited that game companies with big budgets are finally starting to look at this genre again. It's not without its faults, though. The series needs to either remember what made the original so great, or move on. I truly believe Resident Evil 8 can be a new classic survival horror game. Capcom needs to take the old fundamentals of level design and approach to difficulty and apply it to something new, instead of taking something old and retrofitting modern design space into it. This game exists in this in-between area, something that isn't quite new and something that isn't like the old. For now we can remain hopeful about Resident Evil 8 and a remake of 3 if enough people demand it. The groundwork for a good game is all there, it just needs to be arranged under the umbrella of great direction.